People like you shouldn't pretend to understand words, Daniel Hayes said, his voice low enough to sound polite, loud enough to be heard by everyone at the table, and the soft clink of crystal glasses faded just slightly as conversation slowed around him, not stopping, but bending toward the tension that had just entered the room. Sophia Bennett didn't respond immediately, her hand steady on the notepad, her posture composed in the simple black and white uniform that made her nearly invisible to most of the people seated under the warm glow of imported Italian chandeliers. But her eyes, calm, clear, unhurried, lifted to meet his for exactly 1 second, just long enough to register the weight behind his words before dropping again as if nothing had happened. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a subtle smirk forming as he adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, a suit that probably cost more than Sophia made in 2 months. And around him sat men and women who nodded at everything he said, who laughed a little too quickly, who understood that in this room, his opinion shaped reality. Contracts worth tens of millions of dollars sat open on the table, pages filled with dense clauses and foreign terms, the kind of language designed to confuse, to dominate, to separate those who belonged from those who didn't. Let's keep it simple, he added, tapping the document with a silver pen. No need to complicate things. And a quiet ripple of amusement passed through his guests. Polite, controlled, practiced, Sophia wrote down the order. Sparkling water, medium rare steak, no sauce. Her handwriting neat, precise, almost clinical, and for a moment it seemed like the comment had passed right through her, like she had heard worse, like she had learned long ago which words deserved a reaction and which didn't. The restaurant hummed with restrained luxury, polished marble floors reflecting soft golden light, waitstaff moving like shadows between tables, the faint sound of a jazz piano drifting from somewhere unseen. And yet at table 12, something had shifted, something small but undeniable. Daniel picked up the document again, flipping it open to a page filled with tightly packed text in Italian, a deliberate choice, a test disguised as casual arrogance, and he slid it across the table just slightly, not toward his colleagues, but toward the space where Sophia stood. Actually, he said, almost thoughtfully now, why don't you tell me what this says? And a few eyebrows lifted, a few glances exchanged, because this wasn't standard behavior. This was something else, something sharper. Sophia didn't move right away, didn't reach for the paper, didn't defend herself. She simply looked at it, her gaze scanning the lines for a brief second, and then, without asking permission, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, she spoke, her English gone, replaced by something smoother, something precise, something unmistakably fluent. The words flowed in Italian, clear and measured, each sentence unfolding with the kind of confidence that didn't need to prove itself, translating not just the language but the intent, the nuance, the hidden implications buried between legal phrasing. The table went still, not dramatically, not all at once, but in that quiet, almost imperceptible way when attention shifts completely. When forks pause mid-air, when someone forgets to sip their wine. Daniel's smirk didn't disappear immediately, but it stopped growing, froze in place as his eyes sharpened just slightly, recalculating, reassessing. And for the first time since she had approached the table, he actually looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. Sophia finished the sentence, let the final words settle gently into the air, and then returned to her neutral stance, pen resting lightly against the paper, as if she had simply answered a question, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Somewhere in the background, the piano continued to play, soft and steady, but at table 12, the silence had changed shape, no longer comfortable, no longer controlled, and Daniel Hayes, a man who built empires by reading people in seconds, found himself facing something he hadn't expected, not resistance, not defiance, but something far more unsettling, certainty, quiet, unshaken, and impossible to dismiss. Daniel did not interrupt her, not at first, but his fingers, resting lightly on the edge of the table, stilled completely, the subtle rhythm of control he carried into every room slipping just slightly as he listened to the last of her words settle into silence. Then he leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether the moment was real or something he had misread, and without breaking eye contact, he reached for another document. This one marked with dense German text, sharper, more technical, the kind of language even seasoned executives preferred to pass off to specialists. Interesting, he said, his tone quieter now, stripped of the earlier mockery but not yet free of challenge. And he turned the page toward her, not sliding it this time, but holding it, as if daring her to meet him halfway. Sophia did not move immediately, and for a second, the room held its breath again, the faint hum of conversation from nearby tables feeling distant, irrelevant, like background noise in a scene that had narrowed to just two people. Then she stepped closer, just enough to read, her movements measured, unhurried, and when she spoke again, the language shifted effortlessly, German this time, precise and structured, her voice carrying the exact cadence of someone who did not translate word by word but thought within the language itself. A man seated across from Daniel lowered his glass halfway, his brows knitting together in disbelief, while another guest exchanged a quick glance with the woman beside him. Their expressions no longer amused but attentive, recalculating. Daniel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind of focus he reserved for negotiations where millions of dollars hung in balance. And he listened, not just to the words, but to the confidence behind them, to the absence of hesitation, to the quiet authority that did not ask for recognition. When she finished, he did not thank her, did not acknowledge the translation. Instead, he reached again, faster this time, pulling a third document from the stack, this one written in Japanese. Its clean lines and complex characters forming a deliberate escalation, a silent question hanging in the air. Where does it stop? What about this? He asked, and now the room was no longer pretending not to watch. Sophia's eyes moved across the page, and for the first time, a pause, barely a second, just long enough to remind anyone paying close attention that she was human, that she was reading, processing, choosing her words. Then she spoke, her tone softer now, but no less certain, the Japanese, flowing with a natural rhythm that carried both clarity and nuance. And something shifted again, deeper this time, not just surprise, but respect, reluctant, unspoken, beginning to form in the silence between sentences. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, leaning back once more, but this time the movement felt different, less like control and more like distance, as if he needed space to reassess the ground beneath him. How many? He asked, not looking at the documents anymore, but at her. Sophia met his gaze again, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the question stretching just long enough to matter. Then, quietly, she answered, switching back to English as if returning to a default setting. Enough to understand what matters. And the simplicity of the response landed heavier than any display of skill. A faint murmur moved through the table, not loud, not disruptive, but present. Like the first ripple after something drops into still water. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly. And for the first time since the exchange began, there was no trace of amusement in his expression, only calculation, curiosity, and something else he did not immediately recognize. He tapped the pen once against the table, a habit he had when thinking, then set it down entirely, abandoning the documents in front of him as if they no longer held the same importance. Stay, he said, not as a command this time, but as a request that carried unfamiliar weight. And Sophia did not respond right away, her silence no longer passive but deliberate, her presence in the moment no longer invisible. And as the seconds passed, it became clear to everyone at the table that whatever had just begun was no longer about language, and no longer something Daniel Hayes fully controlled. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was unexpected, and Sophia felt it before she responded, the shift in tone, the absence of control that had defined every word Daniel Hayes had spoken until now. She did not sit, did not move closer. She simply remained where she was, grounded, composed, her notepad still in her hand as if the world had not tilted slightly around them. I have other tables, she said quietly, her voice even not dismissive, not submissive, just factual. And for a brief second, something flickered across Daniel's face, not irritation, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone refuses to play the role you assign them. He nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, and leaned back again, this time not to dominate the space, but to observe it, to study her in the same way he studied markets, patterns, risks. 5 minutes, he said, softer now, not a command, not quite a request, but something in between, and Sophia hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she was deciding, and that difference mattered. Around them, the room resumed its quiet rhythm, silverware clinking, low conversations weaving back into place. But at table 12, the air remained different, charged, attentive. Sophia glanced briefly toward her section, calculating, then placed the notepad gently on the edge of the table, not sitting, but standing with a stillness that carried its own kind of authority. Daniel watched that movement closely, the precision of it, the intention behind something so simple, and for the first time in a long time, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied her, not her uniform, not her position, but her presence, the way she occupied space without asking for permission. You corrected the clause, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but no longer sharp, the Italian document. And Sophia gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. It was inconsistent with the previous section, she replied, and the way she said it, clear, direct, without embellishment, made it sound less like an achievement and more like an observation. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, curiosity overtaking caution. What inconsistency? He asked, unable to hide the interest in his voice, and Sophia turned her gaze briefly, acknowledging him without fully shifting her focus. The liability percentage, she said. It was written as 12.5% in the earlier clause, but the later section implied a flat 15% under specific conditions, which would override the initial agreement. And a silence followed, deeper this time, not just surprise, but realization, as eyes moved back to the document, scanning, confirming. Daniel's hand moved toward the paper again, but slower now, more deliberate, and as he read, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the subtle tightening of his brow, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the unmistakable sign of someone recognizing a mistake that should not have been missed, that would have cost us. One of the guests murmured under his breath, and Daniel did not respond, not to them, not immediately, because his attention had narrowed again, back to Sophia. You saw that in seconds, he said, not questioning, not challenging, just stating it. And Sophia met his gaze once more, steady, unflinching. I have seen it before, she replied. And something in the way she said it carried weight, history, a quiet echo of something not yet explained. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, then looked down at the document again, as if the paper now held more than just numbers and clauses, as if it carried a thread leading somewhere deeper. When he looked up again, his voice had changed, not softer, not weaker, but different, stripped of performance. Who taught you that? He asked, and for the first time, Sophia did not answer immediately, her silence no longer neutral, but guarded, deliberate, as if the question had reached a place she did not offer easily. The pause stretched, just long enough to matter, just long enough to shift the balance once again. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it now, something quieter, heavier, someone who is no longer allowed to sign their own name. And the words settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Daniel Hayes, who had built his world on knowing exactly who stood in front of him, realized in that moment that he was only beginning to understand who Sophia Bennett really was. The words did not fade when she finished speaking. They settled, slow and heavy, like something that had been carried for a long time and finally set down without explanation. And Daniel did not look away this time, did not reach for another document, did not attempt another test, because something in her tone had shifted the ground beneath the conversation in a way he could not ignore. Not aloud, he repeated quietly, not as a challenge, but as if testing the meaning of the phrase itself. And Sophia gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze steady but no longer open, as if a door had been acknowledged but not invited to be entered. The man across the table cleared his throat, uneasy now, the earlier curiosity replaced by something more cautious, because this was no longer entertainment, no longer a display. It was becoming personal, layered, and Daniel raised a hand slightly, not looking at him, a subtle signal that ended the interruption before it began. The restaurant continued around them, servers moving, plates arriving, conversations rising and falling. But at table 12, time had slowed, stretched thin between two people who were no longer speaking the same way they had just minutes ago. Daniel leaned forward again, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his posture no longer that of a man performing for an audience, but of someone trying to understand a pattern that did not fit his expectations. "You worked in this field," he said, not asking, just placing the thought into the space between them. And Sophia did not answer right away, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, still, controlled, as if she had learned how to hold herself together in moments exactly like this. "I used to," she said finally, her voice even, but quieter now, and the words were simple, but they carried the weight of something that had been cut short, not ended naturally, not chosen. Daniel studied her more closely now, not searching for weakness, not looking for advantage, but for truth, the kind that does not come easily and does not present itself unless you know how to recognize it. "And now you are here," he said, glancing briefly at her uniform, then back to her face, the observation incomplete on purpose, and Sophia's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second, not defensive, not ashamed, just acknowledging the contrast without needing to explain it. "People change places," she replied, and the sentence was calm, almost neutral, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested the movement had not been voluntary. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, his mind already moving, connecting pieces, because in his world, no one with that level of precision simply walked away from it without reason. "That kind of training does not disappear," he said, his tone thoughtful now, stripped of all earlier arrogance. And Sophia's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, as if the words had reached something she did not often revisit. "No," she said, "it does not." And for a moment, that was all there was, two simple words that held more than anything she had said before. One of the executives shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, and reached for his glass, taking a slow sip as if to anchor himself back in something familiar. But Daniel did not break focus, did not return to the contract, did not reassert control in the way he normally would. Instead, he picked up the Italian document again, scanning the section she had pointed out, and this time, when he read it, he saw it differently, not as a finished piece, but as something flawed, something that had slipped through layers of review, something that should not have been missed. "My team approved this," he said, more to himself than to her, and Sophia did not respond, because she did not need to. The implication was already clear. Daniel set the paper down slowly, his fingers releasing it with a deliberateness that suggested a shift not just in thought, but in perspective, and when he looked up at her again, there was something new in his expression, not just curiosity, not just interest, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize you have misjudged something fundamental. "What happened?" he asked, and this time it was a question, direct, unguarded, and the room seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough for the moment to hold. Sophia did not answer immediately, her silence longer now, heavier, as if the question had crossed a line she rarely allowed others to approach. And for a second, it seemed like she might not answer at all, like she might step back, pick up her notepad, return to the role everyone expected her to play. But she did not move, did not retreat, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but softer, carrying something that had been held in place for a long time. "I saw something I was not supposed to see," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence made it more unsettling, not less, and Daniel felt it. Immediately, the shift from curiosity to something deeper, something that suggested this was no longer just about her past, but about the kind of world he operated in, the kind of decisions that were made behind closed doors. He did not interrupt, did not press further, not yet, because for the first time since she had approached the table, Daniel Hayes understood that this conversation was no longer his to control, and that realization did not weaken him. It changed him, just slightly, but enough to matter. The sentence did not demand attention, but it held it, quietly, completely, and Daniel felt it settle in the space between them like a truth that did not need to be explained to be understood. He did not speak right away, did not reach for the documents again, because something in her tone had shifted the direction of everything. And for the first time that evening, he was not thinking about contracts or outcomes or leverage. He was thinking about consequences. "What did you see?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, not probing for advantage, but for clarity. And Sophia's gaze did not move, but something in it changed, not fear, not hesitation, but calculation, as if she was measuring how much of the past could exist safely in the present. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her words were careful, not vague, but precise in a way that revealed control rather than avoidance. "A clause that was not supposed to be there," she said, and Daniel's attention sharpened immediately, because that language, that phrasing, belonged to his world. "Not supposed to be there," he repeated, his brow tightening slightly, and Sophia nodded once. "It was added after the final review," she continued, her voice steady. "Not in the original agreement. Not in any version that had been approved." And the table, once filled with quiet confidence, now carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by recognition rather than curiosity. Daniel leaned forward again, his focus narrowing, his mind already moving through scenarios, timelines, people, because in his experience, nothing appeared by accident in a document like that. "And you reported it," he said, not as a question, but as the only logical step, and Sophia's expression did not change. But the pause before her response carried more weight than anything she had said so far. "I corrected it," she replied, and the distinction landed immediately, subtle, but important, and Daniel understood it. The difference between pointing something out and taking responsibility for fixing it. One of the executives shifted again, more noticeably this time, his discomfort no longer hidden behind polite detachment. But Daniel did not acknowledge him, did not look away, because he was beginning to see the shape of something that did not fit the narrative he had been given about how the world worked. "What happened after that?" he asked, and this time the question came without strategy, without intention to control the answer, just a need to understand what followed a decision like that. Sophia's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, the smallest movement, but enough to signal that the next part was not neutral, not distant, but something she still carried. "The clause stayed," she said, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, not lighter. Daniel blinked once, processing, recalculating, because that outcome did not align with the logic he trusted, and yet something in her tone told him it was not a misunderstanding. "And you?" he began, but stopped, not because he did not know what to ask, but because he already understood the direction of the answer. Sophia met his gaze fully now, no hesitation, no guardedness, just clarity. "I was removed," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just fact, clean and undeniable. The words settled deeper than before, and for a moment, Daniel did not respond, because there was nothing immediate to say that would not sound insufficient. He glanced briefly at the documents on the table, then back at her, and something connected, something he had not seen when he first walked into the room, because he had not been looking. "You worked on agreements like this," he said slowly, almost to himself, and Sophia gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, and Daniel's jaw tightened, not in frustration, but in recognition, because the error she had pointed out, the precision of it, the speed with which she had identified it, none of that was accidental, none of that was something you learned casually. He leaned back again, but this time the movement carried weight, the kind that comes when certainty begins to shift, and he looked at the Italian document once more, then at her, and for the first time, there was no hierarchy in his gaze, no assumption, just acknowledgement. "They kept the clause," he said quietly, and Sophia nodded once more. "Yes," she answered, and the silence that followed was different from all the others, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with understanding, and Daniel Hayes, who had built his empire on trusting systems and processes and the people who enforced them, realized in that moment that sometimes the flaw was not in the document, but in the decision to ignore it, and that realization did not make him speak louder, it made him still. Daniel did not reach for the glass in front of him, did not return to the conversation with his guests, did not attempt to move the moment forward, because something had already moved without him, something internal, something that did not respond to control or strategy. He looked at the document again. But this time he was not reading the words. He was reading the absence of them, the gap between what should have been corrected and what had been allowed to remain. And for the first time, the paper in his hand felt less like authority and more like evidence. Who approved it? He asked quietly, not looking up yet. His voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Sophia did not answer immediately. Her silence no longer guarded, but measured, as if the answer existed but did not belong to the present moment. It was not one person, she said finally, and Daniel lifted his eyes, the response aligning with what he already suspected. Systems did not fail alone, they failed together. It never is, he replied, almost to himself, and the faintest shift in his expression suggested that something deeper had begun to take shape. Not anger, not blame, but awareness. One of the executives cleared his throat again, this time more firmly, attempting to redirect the room back to familiar ground. Daniel, we should continue the review, he said, gesturing toward the documents. But Daniel did not move, did not acknowledge him right away, because the review had already changed, and it was no longer confined to the pages in front of him. We are reviewing it, Daniel said calmly, and the words, simple as they were, carried enough finality to quiet any further interruption. Sophia remained still, her posture unchanged, but her presence in the conversation no longer incidental, no longer temporary. She was no longer just part of the setting. She had become part of the decision. Daniel set the document down slowly, aligning it with the others, not out of habit, but out of intention, as if placing it there marked the end of one understanding and the beginning of another. You corrected it, he said again, returning to her earlier words, and Sophia nodded once, her expression neutral, but her eyes steady. Yes, she replied, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer than before, not searching, not challenging, just acknowledging the reality that had been placed in front of him. And they removed you, he added, and this time there was a shift in his tone, subtle, but present, not sympathy, not yet, but something closer to recognition of imbalance. And Sophia did not correct him, did not elaborate, because there was nothing to add that would change what had already been understood. The room around them seemed to recede again, not silent, but distant, as if the weight of the conversation had created its own space within it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked a transition, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not in volume, but in intention, stripped of assumption, stripped of certainty. That clause is still in circulation, he said, his gaze shifting briefly to the document before returning to her, and Sophia's eyes moved just slightly, a flicker of recognition that confirmed what he had not yet said out loud. Yes, she answered, and the simplicity of it carried the same quiet finality as before. Daniel leaned back once more, but this time the movement did not distance him from the moment. It placed him within it, fully aware, fully present, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in frustration, but in thought, the kind that did not come from pressure, but from clarity. When he opened them again, he did not look at the others at the table, did not return to the familiar structure of command and response. He looked at Sophia, directly, and for the first time since she had approached the table, there was no hierarchy in the exchange, no assumed position, just two people standing on the same line of understanding. Stay a little longer, he said quietly, and this time the words were not about control, not about convenience. They were about something else entirely, something that had not existed at the beginning of the evening. And Sophia, who had spent most of her life being overlooked or underestimated, recognized it immediately, not as power, but as the absence of it. And that was what made the moment different. The request did not hang in the air this time. It settled gently, without pressure, without expectation, and that was what made Sophia pause, not because she felt obligated to stay, but because she recognized the difference between being asked and being used. She studied Daniel for a brief moment. Not his suit, not his status, but the shift in him, the absence of performance that had defined him only minutes ago. And then she gave a small nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement, a decision made on her terms. She did not sit, still choosing to remain standing, a quiet boundary that needed no explanation, and Daniel noticed it. The choice, the control in something so simple, and he did not question it. Instead, He reached for the document again, not as a test this time, but as a reference, turning it toward himself as if he were now the one catching up. If that clause is still active, he said slowly, his voice measured, then every agreement built on it carries the same flaw. And Sophia's eyes shifted slightly, confirming the logic without needing to state it. Yes, she replied, and the word was soft, but it carried the weight of consequence. One of the executives leaned forward again, concern now overtaking caution. Are you suggesting our current contracts are compromised? He asked, his tone carefully controlled but edged with unease. And Daniel finally turned his head toward him, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a calm that quieted the question before it could grow. I am suggesting we verify them, he said, and the difference between the two statements was not lost on anyone at the table. Sophia remained still, but something in her posture shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the conversation had moved from past to present, from explanation to implication. Daniel looked back at her, his gaze steady, no longer searching for inconsistencies, but for clarity. Why did you not fight it? He asked, and the question was not accusatory, not probing for weakness, but genuinely curious, as if he were trying to understand a decision he himself would not have made. Sophia's expression did not change, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes. Not pain, not regret, just memory. I did, she said simply, and the words were not defensive, not emotional, just factual. Daniel held her gaze, waiting, not pushing, and after a brief pause, she continued, her voice even, controlled. But when a system decides what is true, it does not matter what you prove. And the sentence landed quietly, but it carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not theory, it was lived experience. Daniel leaned back again, absorbing that, his mind moving through structures he had trusted for years, processes he had built, decisions he had delegated, and for the first time, he saw them not as systems of efficiency, but as layers that could conceal as easily as they could protect. And so you left, he said, and Sophia gave a small shake of her head. No, she replied, and the correction was subtle, but important. I was made to leave, and the distinction settled between them, reshaping the narrative in a single sentence. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others as if seeking confirmation that this conversation had gone too far, but no one spoke, because no one wanted to interrupt something that had become undeniably real. Daniel's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table again, but this time there was no tapping, no restless movement, just stillness. And now, he said slowly, you are serving tables. And the words, though simple, carried an acknowledgement that had not existed before, not judgment, not pity, just recognition of contrast. Sophia's lips curved very slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that suggested she had heard that observation many times before and had long since decided what it meant to her. And now, she echoed softly, I am exactly where I need to be. And the calm certainty in her voice did not invite agreement. It simply stated truth as she understood it. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, then glanced again at the document in front of him. The same document that had started as a demonstration of control and had become something entirely different. You still see it, he said quietly, not asking, just recognizing the details, and Sophia nodded once. Yes, she replied, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signaled a decision forming, not yet spoken, but already real. He reached for the pen again, but this time he did not tap it, did not gesture with it. He simply held it, then placed it down beside the document with quiet intention. When he looked up again, his voice was calm, steady, but carrying a clarity that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. Then help me understand all of it, he said, and there was no challenge in the words, no test, just a request grounded in something new, something unfamiliar to him. And Sophia, standing across from him in a uniform that had once defined how he saw her, understood in that moment that the balance had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The request did not rush her, did not pressure her into an answer, and that alone made Sophia pause longer than before, not because she did not understand what he was asking, but because she understood exactly what it meant. She looked at the documents on the table, then back at Daniel, measuring not the words he had spoken, but the space behind them, the shift from authority to inquiry, from assumption to attention. And for a moment, the restaurant seemed to fall away again, leaving only the quiet exchange between two people standing on opposite sides of a story that had just begun to unfold. "You do not need all of it," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, not dismissive, but precise, and Daniel did not interrupt, did not correct her. He simply listened, because that was what had changed. Sophia reached for the Italian document this time, her movement deliberate, controlled, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed, because she was no longer reacting, she was choosing to engage. Her fingers rested lightly on the page as she turned it slightly, angling it toward him, not to show him something new, but to guide him to what had always been there. "This clause," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It is not the problem by itself." And Daniel's eyes followed where she indicated, his focus narrowing, not on her now, but on the words, the structure, the alignment. "It becomes a problem because of what surrounds it," she continued, and as she spoke, her tone carried the rhythm of someone who had explained complex systems many times before, not to impress, not to dominate, but to clarify. She pointed to a section above, then another below, drawing connections that had not been obvious when read in isolation, and the executives leaned in slightly, their earlier skepticism replaced by attention they could not conceal. "This section defines the baseline liability," she said. "But this one," her finger moved, precise, redefines it under conditional language. That appears neutral, but overrides the original intent." And Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, because he could see it now, the layering, the subtle shift in meaning that would go unnoticed unless you were looking for it. "It is not a mistake," Sophia added, her voice softer now, but carrying more weight. "It is a structure." And the words settled into the room differently, not as an accusation, but as a revelation. Daniel leaned closer to the document, his hand resting beside hers for a brief second before he withdrew it slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, and he read the clause again, this time not as a single statement, but as part of a system, a pattern, something designed rather than overlooked. "And this repeats," he said slowly, his voice almost quiet enough to disappear into the background noise of the restaurant. And Sophia gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, "across multiple agreements, and the implications of that did not need to be stated, they were already understood." One of the executives shifted forward, unable to remain silent now. "If this is intentional," he began. But Daniel raised his hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause the interruption, because he was not ready to move away from the clarity that had just been revealed. Sophia stepped back half an inch, not retreating, but creating space, her role complete in that moment. And yet her presence remained central, undeniable. Daniel straightened slowly, his gaze lifting from the document to meet hers again, and for the first time, there was no question in his expression, no uncertainty, just understanding. "You saw the pattern," he said, and Sophia's answer came without hesitation. "Yes," she said. And there was no need to add anything more. The room remained quiet, not because no one had anything to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the table. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the moment when information became decision. And as he looked at the documents again, they no longer represented control or success or negotiation. They represented something else entirely, something that required more than authority to address. When he looked back at Sophia, his voice was steady, grounded, and unmistakably different from the one that had started the evening. "You did not just understand it," he said quietly. "You protected it." And Sophia held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest shake of her head, not denying the statement, but refining it. "I tried," she replied, and the difference between the two words carried everything that had happened since. And Daniel Hayes, who had built his reputation on knowing exactly what mattered, realized that the most important detail in the room had been standing in front of him the entire time, waiting, not to be noticed, but to be understood. The words did not echo loudly, but they stayed, quiet and undeniable, and Daniel felt them settle deeper than anything else that had been said that evening. not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. He looked at the document again, then at the others around the table, and for the first time, he saw something he had not noticed before, not in the text, but in the people, in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way they shifted slightly in their seats, in the way certainty had turned into careful silence. He did not call them out, did not question them directly, because he did not need to. The absence of confidence was already speaking for them. How long? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that cut through the room without raising in volume. And Sophia understood the question immediately, not the words, but the intention behind them. Long enough, she replied, and her tone did not accuse, did not exaggerate. It simply marked time in a way that made the answer heavier than any number could have been. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze lowering to the document once more, but this time he did not read it, he studied it, as if the paper itself had changed, as if it now held something he had overlooked not because he could not see it, but because he had not known to look. One of the executives finally spoke, his voice careful, measured. "We followed standard review protocols," he said, and the sentence sounded complete, but it lacked something that Daniel heard immediately. "Protocols do not miss patterns," Daniel replied quietly, not sharply, not confrontational, just stating a fact that did not need emphasis, and the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to make the distance between words and truth more visible. Sophia remained still, her role once again undefined, not part of the team, not part of the hierarchy, but somehow more aligned with the clarity in the room than anyone seated at the table. Daniel turned back to her, his expression no longer searching, no longer testing, but aligning, as if he had moved from questioning her to recognizing her position within something larger. "You said it repeats," he said, and Sophia nodded once. "Yes," she replied, and her voice carried the same calm certainty as before. "Across different regions, different contracts," she added, not elaborating, just enough to confirm the scale without dramatizing it. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, because scale changed everything. It transformed an isolated issue into a system, and systems required different kinds of decisions. He glanced briefly at the others again, then back at the document, and then, finally, he pushed the papers a few inches away from him, not dismissively, but deliberately, as if creating space between himself and something he could no longer approach the same way. "We pause all approvals," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a weight that made it final, and the words landed without resistance, not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. One of the executives opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, recognizing that this was not a moment for negotiation. Sophia watched quietly, not with surprise, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of stillness that came from having seen this pattern before, not the decision, but the moment before it. When someone finally chose to see clearly, Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to her, and for a brief second, the room faded again, leaving only the line of understanding between them. "You knew this would happen again," he said, and it was not a question. Sophia held his gaze, and for the first time, there was something softer in her expression, not relief, not validation, but recognition of the moment for what it was. "Yes," she said, and the word carried no triumph, only truth. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the end of assumption and the beginning of responsibility. And as he looked at her again, he understood something that had not been clear at the beginning of the evening, something that had nothing to do with language or contracts or status. "You were not wrong," he said quietly, and Sophia did not respond immediately, because the statement, simple as it was, had taken time to arrive, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, unchanged, as if the acknowledgement, while real, did not alter what had already been lived. "I know," she replied, and the quiet certainty in her voice did not challenge him, did not push further. It simply existed, steady, unshaken, and in that moment, Daniel Hayes realized that understanding did not always come with noise or reaction. Sometimes it arrived exactly like this, in silence, in clarity, in the space between what was said and what had always been true. The acknowledgement did not dissolve the tension in the room. It refined it, sharpened it into something quieter, more deliberate, and Daniel felt it as clearly as he saw it, not in the documents, but in the way every person at the table had shifted, subtly, carefully, as if recalibrating their place in a conversation they no longer fully controlled. He did not rush to fill the silence, did not reclaim the space with authority, because something more important had taken its place, something that required patience rather than command. His gaze moved once more to Sophia, not with curiosity now, but with a kind of measured respect that had not existed before, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier assumptions, only clarity. "You knew they would ignore it," he said, and Sophia's expression remained steady, unchanged, but her answer came without delay. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no need to soften the truth, because it had already been lived. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes lowering briefly to the table before lifting again, as if aligning what he had just learned with everything he thought he understood about how decisions were made. "And you still corrected it," he added, and this time there was something in his tone, not surprise, but recognition of a choice that did not benefit the person who made it. Sophia's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table again, still, controlled, and for a moment, she did not respond, not because she did not have an answer, but because the question itself carried more weight than the words. "That was the job," she said finally, her voice quiet, but unwavering, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it was not about obligation, it was about standard. One of the executives shifted again, his discomfort now visible, his voice carefully measured as he attempted to re-enter the conversation. "We cannot assume intent without a full internal review," he said, and Daniel turned his head slightly, not sharply, but enough to acknowledge him. "We will have one," Daniel replied calmly, and the certainty in his tone closed the space for further debate without raising his voice. Sophia stepped back half an inch again, the same subtle movement as before, creating space without withdrawing, her role once again complete in that moment, but her presence still shaping the direction of everything that followed. Daniel picked up the pen once more, but instead of tapping it or gesturing, he placed it directly on top of the document, aligning it with a precision that mirrored the shift in his thinking. "All contracts referencing this structure are to be re-examined," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that did not require emphasis, and the words moved through the table without resistance. Not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. The restaurant around them continued its quiet rhythm, glasses clinking, soft music playing, conversations weaving in and out, but at table 12, something had changed in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to Sophia, and for a brief moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by position or status, but by the shared recognition of something that had been overlooked for too long. "You were not just reading the language," he said quietly. "You were reading the intent." And Sophia held his gaze, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "Language carries intent," she replied, and the statement, simple as it was, reframed everything that had come before it, because it was no longer about translation. It was about interpretation, about seeing what was meant, not just what was written. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the end of one perspective and the beginning of another. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that did not need reinforcement. "Then you were not removed because you were wrong," he said, and this time it was not a question, it was a conclusion. Sophia did not answer immediately, her silence deliberate, measured, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, unchanged. "No," she said, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty that did not ask to be believed, only to be recognized. Daniel nodded once, slowly, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not look at the documents, did not return to the table, he looked only at her, and in that moment, the imbalance that had defined their first exchange no longer existed. Not because it had been corrected, but because it had been understood, and that difference, quiet and precise, changed everything. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if something that had been misaligned for a long time had finally been placed where it belonged. And Daniel did not rush to move past it, did not attempt to soften it or reshape it into something more comfortable, because comfort was not what this moment required. He looked at Sophia again, not as a subject of curiosity, not as a problem to solve, but as a point of clarity in a room that had been built on layers of assumption. "You were made to leave," he said quietly, repeating her earlier words, not to question them, but to acknowledge them fully. And Sophia's gaze held steady, her expression unchanged, but there was something in the stillness, something that suggested the words had finally landed where they were meant to. Daniel turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the others at the table, not sharply, not confrontationally, but with a calm that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. "Who reviewed the international contracts last quarter?" he asked, and the question was simple, but the room felt it immediately, the shift from abstract discussion to direct accountability. One of the executives straightened slightly, his response careful, measured. "Our legal division oversees the final review," he said, and Daniel nodded once, not satisfied, not dismissive, just processing. "And who signs off?" Daniel continued, his voice steady, and this time there was a brief hesitation before. The answer came, a fraction of a second that revealed more than the words themselves. "It varies by region," another voice added, attempting to distribute the responsibility, but Daniel did not look at him, did not follow the redirection, because the pattern was already clear. He reached for the document again, but only for a moment, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper before withdrawing, as if he no longer needed it to confirm what he understood. "It does not vary that much," he said quietly, and the room did not respond, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing to deny. Sophia remained still, her presence no longer at the center of the conversation, but still shaping it, still grounding it in something real. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to her, and for a brief second, the distance between them disappeared again, replaced by something that had nothing to do with status or position. "You saw it before anyone else," he said, and Sophia gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, and the word carried no pride, no emphasis, just fact. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the table, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. "And you said something," he added, and Sophia's eyes shifted just slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the past without reopening it. "I did," she said, and the simplicity of it carried everything that had followed. Daniel nodded once more, slower this time, as if aligning each piece of the story with the reality in front of him, and then he turned back to the others at the table, not sharply, not dramatically, but with a steadiness that made the shift unmistakable. "We are not continuing tonight," he said, his tone calm, controlled, but final, and the words settled into the room without resistance, not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. One of the executives began to speak, then stopped, recognizing that the decision had already been made. Daniel stood slowly, not abruptly, not to assert control, but because the moment had reached its natural end, and as he did, the room adjusted around him, chairs shifting, eyes following, the familiar rhythm of deference returning, but something within it had changed. He looked at Sophia again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, no assumption, just recognition. "Thank you," he said, and the words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything else he had said that evening, because they were not transactional, not expected, they were earned. Sophia held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the acknowledgement, while real, did not alter the path she had already walked. She reached for her notepad again, the simple motion grounding the moment back into reality, and as she did, the room began to move again, conversations resuming, glasses lifting, the evening continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had, something quiet, something precise, something that would not disappear when the lights dimmed and the tables cleared. Daniel Hayes, who had entered the room certain of everything that mattered, left it understanding that the most important truth had not been written in the documents in front of him, but spoken quietly by someone he had almost dismissed, and that realization did not come with noise or spectacle. It came exactly as it should, in stillness, in clarity, and in the space between what he thought he knew and what had always been true. The evening did not end when Daniel stepped away from the table. It shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and Sophia felt it not in the room, but in the way the air settled after he left, lighter in some places, heavier in others. She returned to her work without hesitation, picking up the tray from a nearby station, moving between tables with the same steady rhythm she had maintained all night, her posture composed, her expression neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the last hour had not altered the course of anything at all. But it had, and she knew it, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood. The restaurant continued its quiet symphony, glasses clinking, soft laughter rising and falling, the piano carrying a familiar melody through the room, and Sophia moved within it effortlessly, greeting guests, refilling water, responding to requests with the same calm precision that had defined her every action. But beneath it, something had shifted, something subtle, something internal, across the room. Daniel stood near the entrance for a brief moment, his hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as he spoke quietly with one of his associates, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but his attention was no longer divided. It was focused, directed. And when he glanced back toward the dining area, his eyes found Sophia without searching. She did not look up. Immediately, did not acknowledge the glance, not out of avoidance, but out of choice, because she had already returned to the rhythm of her work, and whatever had passed between them did not need to be repeated to exist. Daniel watched her for a second longer, observing the same details he had overlooked before, the way she moved without hesitation, the way she listened without interruption, the way she spoke without needing to assert herself. And for the first time, he saw it clearly, not as background, not as service, but as structure, the same kind of structure he had spent years trying to build in his own world. He turned then, stepping toward the exit, the quiet murmur of his departure blending into the flow of the evening, unnoticed by most, but not by all. One of the executives lingered at the table, flipping through the documents with a distracted motion, his earlier confidence replaced by something less certain, something that did not sit as comfortably as it had before. And he glanced once toward Sophia, then quickly away, as if unsure how to reconcile what he had seen with what he believed. Sophia did not react, did not follow the glance. She simply continued, placing a plate carefully in front of a guest, offering a quiet, "Enjoy your meal." Her voice steady, her tone unchanged, and the simplicity of the moment grounded everything back into place. Time moved forward, as it always did. Orders were completed, tables turned, the steady rhythm of the restaurant carrying the night toward its natural close, and Sophia remained within it. Consistent, composed, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that surface, something had settled, not pride, not validation, but clarity, the kind that does not come from being recognized, but from knowing you were never mistaken to begin with. Outside, the city moved with its own quiet urgency, headlights passing in soft lines, distant sounds blending into a constant hum. And Daniel stepped into it with a different awareness than the one he had carried inside. Not louder, not heavier, but sharper, more defined. He paused for a brief second before getting into his car, his hand resting on the door, his gaze distant, not lost, but focused inward, tracing the line between what had been presented to him and what had been revealed. And somewhere behind him, inside a restaurant that would close and reopen and continue as it always had, a waitress carried a tray across the floor, steady, composed, unnoticed by most, but no longer unseen by the one person who finally understood what had been in front of him all along. The night did not end with a single moment. It unfolded quietly into something else, something that did not need an audience to exist, and by the time the last table was cleared and the lights dimmed to their softer setting, the restaurant felt the same on the surface, but not beneath it. Sophia moved through the final routines with the same calm precision, stacking plates, wiping down surfaces, resetting the room for another day. Her hands steady, her pace unhurried, as if the evening had been nothing more than another shift, another series of small, ordinary tasks. But in the quiet between those tasks, something remained, Not a memory she replayed, not a moment she held onto, but a clarity that had settled into place without asking for attention. Outside, the city had thinned into a quieter rhythm, fewer cars, softer lights, the distant hum of movement replacing the earlier rush, and somewhere within it, Daniel sat in the back of his car, not on his phone, not reviewing numbers, not preparing for the next decision, but still, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular as his thoughts moved through the evening again, not in fragments, but as a whole. He saw the moment he had spoken too quickly, the assumption he had made without thought, the way the room had shifted when she answered, not just with language, but with something deeper, something that had not needed permission to exist. He did not linger on the mistake itself. He moved past it, toward what it revealed, toward the system he had trusted, the decisions he had approved, the patterns he had not seen because no one had shown them to him in a way he could not ignore. The car slowed at a red light, the soft glow of it reflecting briefly across the window, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked not the end of a thought, but the beginning of a change. Back inside the restaurant, Sophia finished her shift, removing her apron, folding it neatly, placing it where it belonged, her movements as deliberate as they had been all night. And when she stepped outside, the cool air met her without ceremony, grounding. Familiar, unchanged. She did not look back at the building, did not pause. She simply began to walk, her steps steady, her posture relaxed, her presence returning fully to herself, as it always did once the work was done. Somewhere between the quiet streetlights and the distant sound of traffic, there was no trace of what had happened inside, no sign that anything had shifted, and yet it had, in a way that did not require recognition to be real. The next morning would come, as it always did. Contracts would be reviewed, questions would be asked, systems would be examined, and decisions would be made, not loudly, not dramatically, but differently, because once something has been seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And in a city that rarely